Welcome back into the Bangtan universe wormhole. This video is part of a series exploring the gorgeous but notoriously confusing Wings era. And we need to explore it because Wings is part of the BU. In fact, it tells stories about the characters that you won't find anywhere else. You might need some help to understand them, but that's why I'm here. My name is Karen, and I'm a former English teacher with specialized knowledge of art, mythology, and theology, so I can guide you through the Wings era. In this video, we'll be looking at the last of the short films, Seokjin's Awake. It's the longest of the short films, but it needs to be long because it shows us everything Seokjin is going through as he and we prepare to experience blood, sweat, and tears. Now, before we get started, you need to know one thing, the overall storyline of the BU. If you're new to the Bangtan universe, then you need to watch this video before you try to understand Wings. From here on out, I'll assume you are up to date on the BU, and we'll get on with it. If you've been following this series for any length of time, you already know how important it is to know a bit about the novel Demian. So if you do know about Demian, go on to the next section, which is called the quote. If you're not so familiar with Demian, please pause this video for a moment and read the brief explanation I've provided. At the beginning of each short film, RM reads a quote from Demian that sets up the storyline. The Awake short film begins with a quote I've hinted at before and even read in full when I explained Namjoon's short film to you. As a reminder, Sinclair mailed a sketch of a bird to Demian asking for an interpretation of its meaning. We saw Jungkook send his own bird sketch to Namjoon, but Namjoon didn't respond to him. Demian did respond to Sinclair, and this is what he said. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who must be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. We'd better start with a brief refresher on Abraxas and an explanation of his role in Seokjin's video. Abraxas was a pagan deity worshipped by a group called the Gnostics. They believed he accepted everything in life, both good and evil, without judging any of it. But let me be very clear that the BU doesn't view Abraxas as a god, and the BU doesn't tell us not to judge good and evil. Abraxas is just a symbol for the fact that the world and we humans contain both good and evil. Coming to grips with that fact is an essential part of our journey toward adulthood. Now let's look at this passage again, slowly, because of its importance. We'll begin with the baby bird and the egg. That egg is the only world the baby bird knows, but eventually it has to leave that world and keep growing. And since it has to break out, literally, it destroys that world. We humans do something similar, but we have to leave two worlds, and ideally we don't destroy either of them. The first world is the womb, and thankfully we live in an era where most women give birth safely. We're born into the world of our parents or guardians who raise us, and in our younger years, we tend to think they're right about everything. But as we grow, we start to realize they're not right about everything. That's when we begin to question what they've taught us, and when we break out of our second world. This is the point when the bird, quote-unquote, flies toward Abraxas. It's a slow, messy, painful process of examining the beliefs and values we've been taught, then deciding what we really believe. And it's not just a time of thinking about these things. We're also wrestling with temptations that are mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. If we go back to the idea of the baby bird, it's still learning how to use its wings, so it's extremely awkward. Now imagine that baby bird gets caught up in a windstorm, and you'll have an idea of what a human feels like at this stage of life. But eventually the bird learns how to fly right, and we do too. When our own Wings era is finished, we end up with a belief system that includes some things our parents taught us and some things we've decided on our own. This is one step in the process toward individuation. But our heroes are still far from that goal. They're right in the middle of the Wings struggle. Now let's figure out why Big Hit attached this quote to Seokjin's video. Jungkook's short film gave us a quote about the rhythms of day and night, in other words, the different worlds, and the quote said they were mingling. That film ended with the magne sending the bird sketch to his young, Namjoon, who's in the exact center of the group age-wise. The quote at the beginning of his short film was about the horrors of the new world, and he didn't respond to Jungkook's message. Now, finally, in the short film of the oldest Hyung, Jungkook gets his answer. And all of this is completely intentional. Age hierarchy is hugely important in Korea, and the older person is expected to lead the younger ones. That means it's Seokjin's responsibility to guide his 6 friends through the struggles and temptations of this era. He doesn't have a choice. That's why he looks so miserable in this short film. And that's why the lyrics to Awake contain lines like, "It's my fate, but I still want to struggle," and "holding 6 flower petals in my hand." Now let's take a look at the video, which contains more symbols and Easter eggs than any of the other short films, because Seokjin is thinking about all his friends and wondering how to help them. We'll start where the short film does, with the dining room table. The candles are black because we're in the world of darkness now, and all 7 boys have to fumble their way along. We see 3 candles because in Jungian symbolism, the number 3 represents wholeness and individuation. Like I said, the boys won't reach individuation in this era, but it's their final goal. Next, we see the red pills from No, or N.O. I'm never sure how to pronounce that. But the boys in N.O. were forced to swallow these pills to make them obedient. Seokjin had to swallow the same pills in BTS Begins, where they symbolized his obedience to the principal. And he also had an earpiece to receive the principal's instructions. So let me jump ahead for a second and show you that he still has that earpiece, but he's taking it out of his ear. He's rejecting the principal's values, and that's totally appropriate for this era, and for the situation. Back at the center of the table, we see a 6-petaled lily, which we've seen in other MVs as well. We already know the petals represent Seokjin's friends. Now I'll add that in the language of flowers, white lilies represent innocence, purity, and rebirth. Seokjin's friends have already lost their innocence and purity, and thanks to his time travels, many of them have been reborn after dying. But there were 3 lilies to match the 3 candles, and 2 of those lilies are just buds. That's because the boys have a long way to go before they reach individuation. Now let's study that apple. We already know that it represents the knowledge of good and evil, and that gaining that knowledge includes gaining the knowledge that you're a sinner. It means losing your innocence. With that in mind, notice that Seokjin does not eat his apple. He touches it to his face, almost exactly like Jimin did in his short film, but Seokjin mostly just touches it to his nose. Then he drops it. That's very important. It tells us that he's still pretty innocent, at least for a 22-year-old. As far as we know, he hasn't encountered much temptation, and he hasn't questioned much of what his father taught him, other than the bit about obeying the principal. Now, to be fair, his father taught him that being good means being obedient, and vice versa. And that's a hard trap to think your way out of. But right now, several of the friends Seokjin has to lead have experienced a lot more temptation and questioning than he has. So right now, he's questioning his ability to lead them. And because of his upbringing, he's also mourning the loss of his friend's innocence. Notice what happens when he tries to take a picture of the lily. This is the camera he used during the HYYH era to take pictures of his friends. But when he clicks the shutter this time, the candles go out, and they're suddenly white. If you're struggling with the symbolism here, think of it this way. A camera's function is to preserve a moment in time, making it last. So the camera tells us that Seokjin wants to preserve his friend's innocence, which is signified by the lily. And the snuffed out candles tell him that it won't work. What's worse, the fact that the candles turn white after they're snuffed out reminds him that his friend's innocence is already gone, and he wasn't ready to accept it until this moment. When the candles go out, Seokjin looks around the room, and notice that the first thing he focuses on is this bird figurine. Birds are Jungkook's symbol, and right now Seokjin is most worried about Jungkook because he's the youngest and most vulnerable member, and it's painful to think that he's lost his innocence. But looking at the mirror makes things even worse because we see Namjoon's motto there, "You must survive." Seokjin knows that Namjoon is mentoring Jungkook, and he also knows Namjoon can't guide himself, much less anyone else. Now the room has gone dark and we get our first title card. This sentence can be translated a couple of ways, but "No More Dream" is the best translation because it's the title of BTS's debut song. And in that song, BTS challenged their listeners to follow their dreams, even if their parents had something different in mind for them. In other words, BTS were telling their listeners to seek individuation. With the dining room in darkness, Seokjin has to move on, and the only path that's lit is the path with the apple. He's clearly nervous about that, but like the song says, it's my fate. Now notice that he's barefoot. Do you think Jungian symbolism includes bare feet? You better believe it does. Traveling barefoot represents vulnerability, groundedness, and self-discovery. This means Seokjin is determined to do what's right. The question is whether he can manage it, and we'll find the answer to that in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Seokjin has withdrawn into his room many times in the BU, and in the HYYH era, he did it whenever his mission became too hard for him to bear. But the Notes Book 2 shows us that his room can also be a place of restoration, and that's its function here. It even gives him two allies. See these busts? The one on the left is Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and of the moon. If you've watched this video, you know that Seokjin is associated with the moon, withdrawal, and chastity. Speaking of which, you probably think that the Blood, Sweat, and Tears MV has a lot of sexual imagery. But trust me, you have no idea. And the second bust gives us a hint of that. This is an anonymous French woman, which doesn't sound very exciting, but think back to the graffiti from the Run video. One especially large bit said, "Paint me like one of your French girls." That's a quote from Titanic, and a scene where Kate Winslet tries to seduce Leonardo DiCaprio. So here it's a hint of what's to come in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Notice that the busts are looking away from the bed, telling us that Seokjin can't stay here very long. He has a new mission. But while we're here, let's look around. In the dining room, we saw symbols representing Jimin, Jungkook, and Namjoon. And the bedroom contains symbols for all the rest, including Seokjin himself. So I'm going to keep a tally of them all for you. I'll put Jimin, Jungkook, and Namjoon up here and add the others down below as we find them. First, we have this scratched door. In Stigma, we saw Taeyoung trying to scratch out Abraxas, and then he scratched at a bolt on the side of a table. We'll see him scratching a wall in the Japanese Blood, Sweat, and Tears, so clearly scratches are one of his symbols and wings. In fact, if you look closely at these marks, you can see that they spell out the word lie. This connects to the word liar, which we saw on Namjoon's phone booth. It's what Taeyoung thinks of Namjoon, because his Hyung wasn't there when Taeyoung needed him most. And as you'll see on Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Taeyoung hasn't forgiven him. Now here's Yoongi's lighter, and at the all-important timestamp of 1:46, Seokjin sweeps these lily petals off his bed. A few moments later, we see why it's such an important moment. He sets fire to the petals. Why? Because he wishes he could let go of his friends. Not drop them entirely, just stop leading them. He doesn't think he's up to the job. But burning the petals doesn't free him from his responsibility. It just makes him delirious, and he sees more and more symbols of his friends. First, there's the locked cabinet from the storage room, which we saw in the BTS Begins VCR. This is a fancier version, but it's meant to remind you of the cabinet in the storage room. That's where Seokjin, with the help of his friends, will find his father's journal. So this is Seokjin's symbol. And right beside it is Jungkook's painting of Yoongi, which makes a second symbol for Jungkook. Now here's Yoongi's piano, so he gets a second symbol too. And on top of the piano is the symbol for Hosik, a mother with her child. So now we have symbols for all 7 members. But let's take things a few steps farther. Here's a chandelier, and you're going to see more of those in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. By the way, there's also a chandelier in the 2022 Season's Greetings video, which is chock full of Easter eggs. If you haven't seen that video yet, you really should watch it. Now we see Seokjin's eye with a single flying bird. It's not the bird we saw in Jungkook and Namjoon's videos, because that was a smaller bird flying against a red sky. And I don't think this bird connects to any single person. I think it's just a symbol of the Wings era in general. Seokjin knows he has to help his friends and himself find their wings. At last he finds the courage to open his window, which normally means facing the outside world and continuing his mission to save his friends. But this time he faces himself and takes a good, hard, deliberate look. None of his friends have been able to do this when they're by themselves. They're happy when they're together, but they hate themselves when they're alone. So it's very important that Seokjin faces himself so intentionally. He's reflecting on himself, judging his suitability for his role as mentor, and psyching himself up for the job. He's about to leave his bedroom and wake up, and that's why the title of this song is Awake. He's going into the job with his eyes wide open. Now he touches his reflection, creating ripples that might be a callback to the butterfly effect, and are definitely a call forward to Jimin's solo album Face, the oscillations mentioned on the cover of August D, and the wormholes that we predict will play a major role in the next era of the BU. And listen to the sound that accompanies these ripples. I think this could be an airplane taking off, since planes are something else that has wings. Alternately, it could be the sound of a machine revving up. But either way, it tells us Seokjin is about to take off. The title card that follows even confirms this idea, because this is a quote from Moving On, a song written by RM and Suga to commemorate the move from their first tiny dorm to a larger one that allowed BTS to grow. That was a moment when they symbolically fought their way out of the egg. And seeing it here also lets us know that Seokjin has recognized the fact that HYYH, the most beautiful moment in life, was just a moment. It's over now. So he's ready to leave his room, and as he does, let me skip back to show you something else that was happening in the background while he was reflecting on his reflection. The statue of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, turned to face the door. When Seokjin first entered the room, she was just facing away from the bed, which warned him not to stay too long. Now she's looking down the hall, pointing the way forward. But there's one problem Seokjin hasn't addressed, and that's the bust of the Frenchwoman and the apple. The bust hasn't moved, and Seokjin leaves the apple behind when he leaves the room. In other words, he's ignoring his own temptations, which might include sex and definitely include romance. And when he has a girlfriend in the love yourself era, he takes a very wrong approach with her. Walking down the hall, Seokjin brushes his hand along the wallpaper, and we see Abraxas all through the design. Touching Abraxas tells us Seokjin is now accepting the idea that the world is composed of right and wrong, even though he has so little experience with doing wrong. Then he reaches the painting of Jungkook's bird, and he pauses to contemplate and accept it. Seokjin knows it's time for Jungkook to grow up, and Seokjin intends to be there for him. Then we move back to the bedroom for the final shot, the Polaroids that show each of the boys' symbols. We see the mirror with Namjoon's motto, the mother figure for Hosik, the apple for Jimin, the piano for Yoongi, the bird for Jungkook, and the scratches and word lie for Taeyoung. You've probably already figured out one way in which Seokjin's circle is unique, and that's the fact that it's the only one that doesn't combine with anyone else's. But there's another way it's unique. It changes shape several times before reaching its final form. And the in-between shapes are pretty interesting. I'll slow the footage down here so we can see all the shapes clearly. This one might be a net or a cage, or both. I'd say both. The net might be there to catch his friends if they fall too far in the Wings era, and it might also be a cage to keep him from abandoning his role as their guide. And this second shape might be a stronger net that encloses them on all sides, but also that encloses Seokjin on all sides. Incidentally, this shape reminds me of an HYYH era photo shoot called, appropriately enough, Anxiety. So I'm going to call this a disco ball, even though it isn't. The disco ball becomes a solid glowing shape that might be the moon, which definitely does connect to Seokjin. The moon splits into 4 smaller shapes which will eventually form the Wings album cover, but we're not there yet because a second, finer-grained disco ball appears in the middle of them. Then everything spins back together to form the album cover. I guess this means the solid 3D circle contains all the other circles, the net that protects the boys but cages Seokjin, Seokjin's anxiety, and the 3 pairs of Hyungs with maknaes whom he watches over. But I really truly am just guessing about all this. I'd love to know what you think is going on with Seokjin's circle. Drop me a comment. Well, now we finished the 7 short films of the Wings era, but they were basically previews to the main event, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. This is where we'll see all the new pairs in action, for better and for worse. I'm planning to split my analysis of the Korean Blood, Sweat, and Tears across 2 videos because it's going to be intense. Then I'll analyze the Japanese Blood, Sweat, and Tears in 1 video and focus on the stories it tells. And those stories are things you won't find in any other BU materials, so that makes them very exciting. And that's what's coming next. As BTS would say, please look forward to it. Now it's your turn. Drop me a comment to let me know what you think, especially about Seokjin circles. And please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, since that helps us get noticed by the YouTube algorithm, which helps you find our latest content. Apo bangpo!